Imagine climbing into the cockpit of your Messerschmitt Bf 109 at dawn. Below, the fields of Germany are shrouded in mist. Ahead, a black cloud fills the sky, not weather, but hundreds of four-engine bombers flying in perfect formation. Each one carries more explosives than your entire squadron can destroy in a week. This was the moment Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe ace with dozens of victories, realized the war was already lost. When Heinz Knoke first joined the Luftwaffe, the Air Force of Nazi Germany was still considered the most advanced in the world. Sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters dominated the skies over Europe in 1939 and 1940, and the Blitzkrieg campaigns across Poland, France, and the Low Countries had shown the terrifying power of coordinated air and ground warfare. Knoke, like many young German pilots, believed he was part of an elite brotherhood destined to protect the Reich and guarantee German superiority. His early experiences reinforced this belief. Luftwaffe pilots were meticulously trained, often flying hundreds of hours before ever seeing combat, and the emphasis was on producing quality over quantity, small numbers of highly skilled aces rather than mass-produced crews. This philosophy seemed justified during the Battle of France and even in the early months of the Battle of Britain. German pilots routinely racked up multiple kills in a single day, and legends like Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders became national heroes. But beneath the propaganda lay hidden weaknesses. The Luftwaffe had been designed as a tactical air force, meant to support ground troops with close air support and short-range bombing, not a long-range strategic bombing campaign. Germany had no equivalent to America's heavy four-engine bombers, and while the Reich was producing advanced fighters, the numbers were never enough to replace losses. By 1942, as Germany expanded deeper into the Soviet Union and faced growing Allied resistance, the Luftwaffe's resources began to stretch thin. Bombing campaigns over Britain had failed, the Eastern Front was consuming men and machines, and in North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps was being hunted by Allied air power. Still, for young men like Heinz Knoke, the Luftwaffe represented Germany's pride. He believed in the ace system, in the myth that a handful of skilled German pilots could turn the tide against any number of opponents. It was an illusion that would soon shatter, because by 1943, the United States was entering the war in full force, and with it came a level of industrial production Germany could not even imagine. And on October 14, 1943, Knoke would see the truth with his own eyes. Wave after wave of American bombers blotting out the sky, a storm of steel that no amount of courage or skill could ever defeat. On the morning of October 14, 1943, Heinz Knoke climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 109 and prepared for another day of interception duty. But this was no ordinary mission. Reconnaissance reports had already signaled that a massive formation of American bombers was heading toward Schweinfurt, home to Germany's critical ball-bearing factories. Without these bearings, tanks, trucks, and aircraft across the Reich would grind to a halt. When Knoke's squadron reached altitude, the horizon itself seemed to change. Before him stretched a sight so overwhelming that even a battle-hardened Luftwaffe ace felt his stomach tighten. 291 American B-17 flying fortresses, their silver fuselages glittering in the sunlight, flying in tight, disciplined combat box formations. Each B-17 bristled with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, creating overlapping fields of fire. To break into their defensive wall, a German pilot had to face a hurricane of bullets. It wasn't just a battle of planes, it was a battle of mathematics. Knoke realized it instantly. Even if every German fighter scored a kill, the bombers would still reach their targets. And the Americans weren't sending a single raid. By late 1943, Allied production lines were rolling out hundreds of new bombers and fighters every month. As Knoke dove into the formation, tracers tore past his canopy. He squeezed the trigger, his cannons spitting fire at a fortress, but the return fire from gunners stitched across the sky in every direction. Knoke broke away just as the bomber he had aimed at lurched, trailing smoke, but dozens more pressed forward, unmoved, steady, and relentless. Below, German cities burned. Ball-bearing plants were shattered, and despite heavy losses that day, 60 bombers destroyed, more than 600 airmen killed or captured, the Americans had shown something terrifying. They could absorb massive losses and come back the very next week with even more planes. For Knoke and others in the Luftwaffe, the sight of that endless stream of bombers was a revelation. Germany was not just fighting pilots in the air. It was fighting America's factories, its workers, its endless assembly lines. And in that moment, as the sky filled with aircraft built thousands of miles away in Detroit, Seattle, and California, Knoke understood a brutal truth. No matter how skillful the Luftwaffe's pilots were, Germany could never outproduce the United States. The shock of Schweinfurt was only the beginning. In early 1944, the Americans launched what became known as Operation Argument, or more simply, Big Week. From February 20th to 25th, waves of American bombers, escorted by an ever-growing fleet of fighters, struck at Germany's aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and critical supply centers. The objective was clear: destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground before the planned invasion of France later that year. For Heinz Knoke and his fellow pilots, Big Week was a nightmare unlike anything they had ever faced. On one mission, he described climbing into the sky only to see hundreds of contrails stretching across the heavens, like white scars drawn against the blue. Each contrail marked another American bomber, an endless procession of silver giants, escorted by sleek new fighters. And among those escorts was the aircraft that would change everything, the North American P-51 Mustang. Until this moment, German pilots had counted on one advantage: American and British fighters couldn't follow the bombers all the way into the heart of Germany. Short-range Spitfires and Thunderbolts had to turn back after escorting the formations for only part of the journey. Once they left, the bombers were vulnerable. But the Mustang changed the equation. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, drop tanks, and extraordinary range, the P-51 could fly all the way from English airfields to Berlin itself and still fight. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe wasn't just attacking bombers. Every time Knoke dove on a fortress, swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts appeared, diving from above, faster, and often in greater numbers than the Germans themselves. During Big Week alone, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 600 fighters and hundreds of veteran pilots. The Americans lost bombers too, more than 240 flying fortresses and Liberators, but unlike Germany, they could replace both machines and men. U.S. training schools were turning out thousands of new pilots every month, while German replacements received barely a fraction of the training time once given to the aces of 1939. Knoke wrote in his diary that February, "We are being ground down. Every mission costs us more irreplaceable comrades, while the enemy only grows stronger. The sky itself seems endless with their machines. It is no longer a duel, it is a slaughter." The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death, and Knoke, like many German pilots, began to grasp that the war was no longer about tactical brilliance or individual skill. It was about industry, numbers, and time. And on all three counts, America had already won. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's situation had gone from dire to catastrophic. The Americans had not only gained control of the skies through numbers and technology, they had begun to choke Germany's war machine at its most vulnerable point: fuel. Germany's entire air force, tank divisions, and mechanized army depended on a fragile lifeline of synthetic fuel plants. With limited access to natural oil, the Third Reich relied on coal-to-liquid conversion facilities at places like Luna, Politz, and Blechhammer. These plants produced just enough gasoline to keep the Luftwaffe in the air and the panzer divisions rolling. But the Allies knew this, and beginning in May 1944, American bombers turned their attention to those targets. The results were devastating. On May 12th, over 900 bombers struck the Luna works. Just weeks later, the plant at Politz was reduced to rubble. One by one, the synthetic fuel facilities went up in flames. By August, Germany's aviation fuel production had collapsed by more than 90%. For Heinz Knoke and his comrades, this meant something unthinkable. They had aircraft, but no fuel to fly them. Luftwaffe units were forced to ration flight hours so severely that new recruits received barely 10 hours of training before being sent into combat. By contrast, American pilots typically logged 200-plus hours before even facing the enemy. Knoke described standing on airfields where rows of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs sat idle, their sleek fuselages shimmering in the sun, but with empty tanks, they were nothing more than statues. Meanwhile, American bombers flew overhead in ever greater numbers, their contrails carving across the skies unopposed. In one striking incident, Knoke recalled watching a formation of flying fortresses rumble over Germany while his entire unit remained grounded. His words captured the despair. "We could only look up in frustration, like men watching their homes burn while holding buckets with no water. Our wings were clipped not by their guns, but by the absence of fuel." By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer an effective fighting force. Squadrons that had once fielded dozens of aircraft could now manage only a handful per sortie. Even the introduction of advanced jets like the Me-262 could not reverse the tide, because there was simply not enough fuel to keep them flying. Germany's skies, once dominated by the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the Allies. And for Knoke, the war was taking on a grim inevitability. The Luftwaffe hadn't just lost its air superiority, it had lost the ability to fight at all. If fuel shortages grounded much of the Luftwaffe's strength, the effect on pilot training and attrition was even more catastrophic. By 1944, the German High Command faced a cruel paradox. There were still plenty of young men willing to fly, but the Reich could no longer properly train them. Before the war, Luftwaffe pilots underwent rigorous instruction, often logging 200 to 250 flight hours before joining a frontline unit. This training produced the skilled veterans who had dominated Europe's skies in 1939 to 41, men like Galland, Mulders, and Marseille. But as the war dragged on and fuel supplies collapsed, training hours plummeted. By late 1944, recruits were being sent into combat with as little as 20 to 30 flight hours total. Some had never even fired their weapons in the air before facing American bombers. The results were devastating. Every Allied bomber formation was now guarded by long-range fighters, P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings, that hunted inexperienced German pilots mercilessly. New Luftwaffe recruits often didn't survive their first mission. Entire classes of young men were being wiped out within weeks of arriving at the front. Heinz Knoke described the horror in his diary. "We were sending boys into the sky who could barely take off, let alone fight. They went up full of courage and came down in flames. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter." Meanwhile, American pilots benefited from an industrial system that could afford to lavish training hours, fuel, and aircraft on every recruit. A U.S. Army Air Force's pilot might spend a year or more preparing for combat, often with hundreds of hours behind the controls and advanced gunnery practice. The difference showed in the numbers. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than they could replace them. Over 12,000 German fighter pilots were killed in 1944 alone, a staggering toll that hollowed out the once elite force. To make matters worse, the few surviving veterans were exhausted. Men like Galland and Steinhoff could see that the Luftwaffe was being bled white, forced to throw unprepared boys against the full weight of American industry. Knoke himself noted how morale collapsed as veterans watched their replacements perish. "We had no hope of victory, only the duty to fight on. We looked at the new faces, pale and determined, and knew they would not be with us long." By the winter of 1944 to 45, the Luftwaffe was effectively a shell of its former self. What had once been the pride of Germany, the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, was reduced to scattering handfuls of undertrained pilots against bomber streams numbering in the hundreds. The outcome was no longer in doubt. For Knoke and his comrades, every flight was now a desperate gamble for survival in a war that was already lost. By early 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces prepared to deliver the decisive blow to the Luftwaffe. This campaign, codenamed Operation Argument, better remembered as Big Week, would change the balance of the air war forever. The plan was simple but ruthless. Unleash massive, sustained bombing raids against Germany's aircraft industry. Factories building Messerschmitt Bf 109s, Focke-Wulf FW 190s, and critical ball-bearing plants would be hit again and again until the Luftwaffe could no longer replace its losses. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, more than 3,500 sorties were flown. Waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, escorted by the newly introduced P-51 Mustangs, poured across German skies. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week was both a challenge and a trap. They had no choice but to rise and defend their homeland. Every available squadron was thrown into battle. The fighting was ferocious. Entire bomber formations clashed with swarms of German fighters. The air was filled with tracer fire, exploding shells, and burning wrecks spiraling to the ground. In just 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost over 600 aircraft, and, more critically, thousands of irreplaceable pilots. American losses were heavy too, about 250 bombers destroyed, but U.S. production could replace them almost instantly. Ford's Willow Run plant could build a new B-24 every 63 minutes. For Germany, every plane and pilot lost was a wound that would never heal. Heinz Knoke flew during these battles and described the skies as black with bombers. He admitted that the endless streams of aircraft seemed almost inhuman. They came like a storm that never ended. We fought until our ammunition was gone, until our arms were weak, but still they kept coming. We knew then, no courage, no skill, could hold back such a tide. Big Week marked the turning point. After February 1944, the Luftwaffe was never again able to mount an effective defense against the Allies' bombing campaign. Factories lay in ruins, training programs collapsed, and the surviving pilots were pushed into a war of attrition they could not win. For the Americans, the skies over Europe had opened. For the Germans, Big Week was the moment they realized the end had already begun. By the end of 1944, even the most determined Luftwaffe veterans understood that the battle for the skies over Europe was lost. Every day brought fresh bomber streams. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s, escorted by squadrons of P-51 Mustangs that seemed to appear from nowhere. The once proud Luftwaffe, which had dominated Europe in 1940, was now hopelessly outnumbered. The mathematics told the story. By war's end, the United States had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft. Germany managed just over 119,000, and most of those were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Every German fighter destroyed represented months of lost work, scarce resources, and, too often, the death of a highly trained pilot. Every American bomber lost was replaced almost instantly by the arsenal of democracy, with Ford, Boeing, and Douglas running their production lines 24 hours a day. Heinz Knoke described the grim realization vividly. When I saw entire formations of hundreds of bombers, and behind them yet more, stretching as far as the eye could see, I knew the truth. The war was no longer fought between men and machines. It was fought between nations of steel and oil, and Germany had already lost. This recognition was echoed by Luftwaffe leaders. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most famous aces, admitted after the war that the day the P-51 appeared in the skies over Berlin, the war was lost. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history, lamented how he and his comrades were forced to lead boys with barely any training against an enemy that had both numbers and experience on its side. Even the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighters, faster and deadlier than anything the Allies had in 1944, could not turn the tide. There simply weren't enough of them, nor enough fuel to keep them in the air. By the time American troops crossed the Rhine in 1945, the Luftwaffe was reduced to a shadow. Entire squadrons existed only on paper. Knoke himself survived the war, but he carried with him the memory of those endless skies filled with bombers, a sight that broke the spirit of even Germany's bravest pilots. In the end, the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed not by lack of courage or skill, but by a brutal truth. Industrial democracy had outproduced the Reich into extinction.